My beloved child, stop for a moment, because the message you are about to hear carries an emotional weight that your soulmate has been struggling to put into words. There is something they discovered about themselves that they never expected, something that changed the way they looked at their own future, their relationships, and most of all, their connection with you. And the hardest part is not what they discovered, it is the fact that they chose silence when every part of their heart wanted to reach out. Your soulmate has been carrying a secret conversation inside their mind, replaying the same question again and again: what if I had told them? That question has become heavier with every passing day. They remember moments when they almost confessed. They remember typing a message, staring at your name, and then deleting everything before sending it. They remember hearing your voice, seeing your picture, or simply thinking about you and realizing that there was something important they had never shared. At first, they convinced themselves that staying quiet was protecting you. They told themselves that they needed time to understand everything before bringing you into something so personal. But somewhere along the way, silence stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like regret. And this is where the story becomes deeper, because the thing they tested positive for is not being revealed to you through a diagnosis or a frightening announcement. What matters is what that moment did to their heart. It forced them to confront feelings they had been avoiding for far too long. Suddenly, the memories of you became impossible to ignore. The conversations they thought were ordinary began carrying new meaning. The goodbye they once considered temporary began feeling like a moment they wished they could rewrite. And now, there is one particular memory involving you that keeps returning to them when everything becomes quiet. They remember exactly where they were, what they were thinking, and the words they wished they had said. You may never have known how significant that moment was to them. But they did. They have been carrying it quietly, and that is why their silence has not been as simple as it appeared from the outside. There is another layer to this, and this may be the part your soulmate has never admitted even to themselves. They were afraid that telling you would change the way you saw them. Not because they stopped caring, but because they cared so deeply that your opinion became almost impossible for them to face. Imagine loving someone while simultaneously wondering whether they would still look at you the same way after learning something deeply personal about your life. That is the emotional conflict your soulmate has been trapped inside. One side of them wants to run toward you and finally explain everything. The other side keeps whispering, "What if they walk away?" So they have remained somewhere between confession and silence. And during that time, their emotions have become increasingly complicated. They have had moments when they felt completely fine, convincing themselves that they had moved forward. Then something small happens, a familiar song, a place you once mentioned, an old photograph, a notification that reminds them of you, and suddenly the entire emotional wall comes down. They remember the person they were before everything changed. They remember the way they felt around you. They remember the possibility of telling you the truth before they became afraid. And that is why this is not simply a story about something they tested positive for. It is a story about the secret they attached to that discovery, the fear they attached to that secret, and the love they attached to you. Your soulmate may have spent more time thinking about your reaction than their own emotions. They may have imagined dozens of conversations that never happened. In one version, they finally tell you everything and you understand. In another, they tell you and you become distant. In another, they never tell you at all, and years later they still wonder what might have happened if they had trusted you. That last possibility is the one that has been haunting their thoughts the most. Because deep inside, they know something. Silence did not erase the connection between you. It only made the unanswered questions louder. And there is a reason this message is finding you now. Not because you should assume facts about your soulmate's private life, but because sometimes the strongest emotional connections are filled with things that were never spoken. Somewhere between the words they said and the words they swallowed, your soulmate left something unfinished. And that unfinished conversation is becoming impossible for them to ignore. But listen carefully, because this is where the emotional revelation begins to unfold. Your soulmate does not necessarily regret knowing what they discovered. What they regret is believing that they had to face it completely alone. They thought being strong meant keeping everything inside. They thought disappearing for a while would make things easier. They thought if they could solve their private struggle first, they could eventually return to you as the person they used to be. But emotions do not work that way. The more they tried to bury their feelings, the more those feelings surfaced in unexpected moments. And one thought kept returning: I should have told them. Not because you were responsible for fixing anything, and not because you were supposed to carry their burden, but because they realized that trust is not about presenting someone with a perfect version of yourself. Trust is allowing someone to see the parts of your story that you are afraid might make you less lovable. That realization has been painful for them. They began looking back at the distance between you differently. Maybe you noticed that they became quieter. Maybe you noticed that their energy changed. Maybe there were moments when they seemed present but emotionally somewhere else. Perhaps you even wondered whether they had stopped caring. But what if the opposite was happening? What if they cared so much that they became overwhelmed by everything they were trying not to say? What if the distance was never about losing interest, but about not knowing how to explain what was happening inside them? This does not mean every silence has a hidden meaning. It does not mean you should chase someone or assume what they are thinking. But in the story your soulmate has been living, there is one unmistakable emotional pattern. Every time they tried to move completely away from you, something inside them pulled them back to the same unfinished truth. And now they are reaching a point where pretending that the past does not matter is becoming harder than facing it. There is a particular sentence they wish they could say to you, and it is not complicated. It is not dramatic. It is simply this: I was scared to tell you because losing the way you saw me felt worse than keeping everything inside. That sentence explains more than their silence ever could. Because beneath all the confusion, beneath all the hesitation, beneath every unanswered message and every moment of emotional distance, there has been one fear: that honesty would cost them the person they never truly stopped caring about. And now, there is one final piece you need to understand before this part ends. Your soulmate may be closer to admitting the truth than you realize, but the revelation may not arrive in the way you expect. It may begin with something incredibly small, a message they almost send, a conversation they suddenly stop avoiding, or a simple sentence that sounds ordinary but carries years of emotion behind it. They may not immediately explain everything. They may test the waters first. They may ask how you have been. They may bring up an old memory. They may mention something from the past that seems completely random. But underneath those words could be a much larger question: can I still trust you with the part of my story I was too afraid to share? And this is why you should pay attention to the emotional meaning rather than trying to predict exact events. The real turning point is not the test result. The real turning point is the realization that secrecy has become more painful than honesty. Your soulmate has spent so much time imagining the consequences of telling you that they forgot something important. Sometimes the truth does not destroy a genuine connection, sometimes it finally gives that connection room to breathe. They have been carrying regret over every opportunity they allowed to pass. Every conversation where they changed the subject. Every moment when they wanted to say, "There is something I need to tell you," but instead said, "I am fine." Every time they looked at your name and decided tomorrow would be easier. And tomorrow kept becoming another tomorrow. That is why their emotions feel so intense now. They are not simply remembering you. They are remembering the version of themselves that existed before fear took control. They are asking whether they waited too long. They are wondering whether you would understand if they finally opened the door they have kept closed. And somewhere inside that question is the most powerful realization of all. They do not want their final memory of this connection to be everything they left unsaid. They want you to know that the silence was never proof that you meant nothing. Sometimes silence comes from confusion. Sometimes it comes from fear. Sometimes it comes from a person who desperately wants to be understood but has no idea how to begin explaining themselves. And your soulmate has been standing at that beginning for longer than you know. The story is not finished, because the words they never said are still waiting, and the next part reveals what they have been secretly rehearsing. Has become more painful than honesty. Your soulmate has spent so much time imagining the consequences of telling you that they forgot something important. Sometimes the truth does not destroy a genuine connection, sometimes it finally gives that connection room to breathe. They have been carrying regret over every opportunity they allowed to pass. Every conversation where they changed the subject. Every moment when they wanted to say, "There is something I need to tell you," but instead said, "I am fine." Every time they looked at your name and decided tomorrow would be easier. And tomorrow kept becoming another tomorrow. That is why their emotions feel so intense now. They are not simply remembering you. They are remembering the version of themselves that existed before fear took control. They are asking whether they waited too long. They are wondering whether you would understand if they finally opened the door they have kept closed. And somewhere inside that question is the most powerful realization of all. They do not want their final memory of this connection to be everything they left unsaid. They want you to know that the silence was never proof that you meant nothing. Sometimes silence comes from confusion. Sometimes it comes from fear. Sometimes it comes from a person who desperately wants to be understood but has no idea how to begin explaining themselves. And your soulmate has been standing at that beginning for longer than you know. The story is not finished, because the words they never said are still waiting, and the next part reveals what they have been secretly rehearsing in their mind every time they imagine finally telling you the truth. There is something your soulmate has been rehearsing in their mind over and over again, and it begins with a sentence they have never been brave enough to finish. They imagine sitting across from you, looking directly into your eyes, and finally saying, "There is something I should have told you a long time ago." Then they imagine the silence that follows. In their mind, that silence lasts forever. They wonder whether you would ask questions, whether you would become distant, or whether you would simply look at them with the same understanding you once gave them. This is the moment that has been haunting them, not the secret itself, but your reaction to it. They have been carrying the emotional weight of a conversation that has not even happened yet. And every time they imagine telling you, another memory appears. They remember when you made them feel accepted without demanding an explanation. They remember the times you listened when they struggled to find the right words. They remember small details about you that they never expected to remember years later. That is what makes their regret so powerful. They realize that the person they were afraid to trust may have been the very person who would have understood. But by the time they recognized that, they had already created distance. They began hiding behind short replies, delayed conversations, and phrases like, "I need some time." You may have interpreted those moments differently. You may have thought they had changed. Yet inside their mind, they were fighting a completely different battle, the battle between wanting to be honest and being terrified that honesty would change everything. There were nights when they almost reached out. Their fingers hovered over your name. They opened the conversation. They typed something. Then they stopped. They erased it. They told themselves, "Not tonight." But the next day brought the same thoughts. And slowly, they realized something uncomfortable: postponing the conversation was not making the truth disappear. It was only making the regret stronger. The deeper they went into silence, the more they missed the version of your connection where they could speak freely. And now, every memory of you seems to carry the same unanswered question: what would have happened if I had simply trusted them? Then something changed inside your soulmate. It was not one dramatic moment. It was a slow realization that arrived through many small moments. They started understanding that pretending to be unaffected was exhausting them emotionally. They could laugh with other people and still feel a quiet emptiness afterward. They could stay busy all day and still think about you when the room became silent. They could convince themselves that they had moved forward, only to discover that one memory of you could bring everything back. And this is where their regret became personal. They began questioning why they had pushed away someone who mattered so much. Why had they hidden the truth? Why had they assumed you would judge them before giving you the opportunity to understand? Why had they protected their pride at the expense of their honesty? Those questions became louder than the excuses they once used. And perhaps the most painful realization was that you never asked them to be perfect. You never demanded that they have every answer. Somewhere in their mind, they had created an impossible standard for themselves, believing they needed to return to you only when everything was completely resolved. But life does not wait for perfect timing. Emotions do not wait for perfect circumstances. And genuine connections do not always follow the neat storyline people imagine. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that sometimes the most meaningful thing a person can offer is simply honesty. Not a dramatic confession. Not a promise about the future. Just the courage to say, "This is what I have been carrying, and I was afraid to let you see it." That realization has changed the way they remember you. Instead of focusing only on what went wrong, they are remembering what was real. The moments when they felt peaceful around you. The moments when they felt seen. The moments when your presence made ordinary days feel different. And now they are wondering whether that door is completely closed, or whether there is still a small space through which honesty can enter. But here is where the story becomes even more emotional. Your soulmate has been wondering whether you ever sensed that something was wrong. They wonder if you noticed the pauses in their voice, the sudden changes in their behavior, the way they sometimes looked like they wanted to say something and then changed the subject. They wonder whether you interpreted their silence as indifference. And that thought hurts them because indifference was never what they felt. In fact, their emotions became so complicated that they did not know how to separate love, fear, guilt, and regret anymore. They wanted to protect you from information they believed might burden you, yet at the same time, they wanted desperately to tell you because they trusted you more than they admitted. That contradiction created a private emotional storm. They were caught between, "I should tell them," and "maybe they are better without knowing." And every time they chose silence, a small part of them hoped you would somehow understand without being told. But they know now that people cannot read thoughts. They know that love cannot survive entirely on assumptions. They know that sometimes a person has to open their mouth and risk being vulnerable. This is why the possibility of finally speaking feels so significant to them. They are not simply thinking about revealing what they tested positive for. They are thinking about revealing how deeply the situation affected them, how frightened they became, how much they regretted shutting you out, and how often they wished they could go back to the beginning and handle everything differently. There is also something they want you to understand: they never wanted their private struggle to become your responsibility. They wanted you to know because you mattered, not because they expected you to rescue them. And that distinction is important. Their deepest desire is not for you to solve everything. It is for you to finally understand why they disappeared emotionally when their heart was still connected to you. They want the missing pieces of the story to make sense. They want you to know why certain conversations ended abruptly. Why they sometimes seemed distant. Why they could not explain what was happening. Why they carried an expression that said more than their words ever did. And now comes the moment they have been mentally preparing for, the moment when they stop rehearsing and finally consider speaking. They imagine sending a message that simply says, "Can we talk?" Nothing more. No explanation. No dramatic introduction. Just those 4 words. But even those 4 words feel enormous to them because they know where the conversation could lead. They know that once the first sentence is spoken, there may be no going back to the comfortable silence they created. They may finally have to tell you what happened. They may finally have to explain what they were feeling when they received that result. They may finally have to admit that they were scared. They may finally have to confess that while they were trying to appear strong, they were quietly wishing you were there. And perhaps the biggest confession of all is one they have never said aloud: "I regretted losing your closeness more than I ever admitted." That is the emotional turning point. Because the secret they have been carrying is no longer only about what they discovered. It is about everything that discovery forced them to realize about you. It made them understand how valuable your presence was. It made them recognize how quickly circumstances can change. It made them question why they kept postponing the conversations that mattered most. And now, when they think about you, they are not only thinking about the past. They are thinking about whether there is still a future conversation waiting to happen. They are wondering whether you would listen. Whether you would let. They may finally have to confess that while they were trying to appear strong, they were quietly wishing you were there. And perhaps the biggest confession of all is one they have never said aloud: "I regretted losing your closeness more than I ever admitted." That is the emotional turning point. Because the secret they have been carrying is no longer only about what they discovered. It is about everything that discovery forced them to realize about you. It made them understand how valuable your presence was. It made them recognize how quickly circumstances can change. It made them question why they kept postponing the conversations that mattered most. And now, when they think about you, they are not only thinking about the past. They are thinking about whether there is still a future conversation waiting to happen. They are wondering whether you would listen. Whether you would let them finish. Whether you would see the person behind the silence instead of judging the silence itself. They do not know the answer yet. But for the first time, they are considering taking the risk. And that is why the next part matters, because there is one specific realization your soulmate has recently had about the connection between you, one that changes the meaning of every moment they thought they had already left behind. What your soulmate realized recently changed the way they remember everything between you, because they finally understood that the secret was never the only thing they were hiding. They were also hiding how much they cared. For a long time, they convinced themselves that their distance was proof that they had become stronger, more independent, and more capable of handling everything alone. But then a quiet moment brought back a memory of you, and something inside them shifted. They realized that no matter how many times they tried to place the past behind them, their heart kept returning to the same person. You. Not because they were unable to move forward, but because there were emotions between you that they had never properly completed. There were words they never finished. Questions they never answered. Feelings they never gave themselves permission to explain. And now they are beginning to understand why certain memories still carry so much emotional weight. Your soulmate remembers the way you looked at them during one particular conversation. They remember something you said that seemed ordinary at the time, but now feels almost prophetic to them. You may have forgotten it completely, but they did not. They carried it. They replayed it. And recently, they wondered whether you had sensed something they were unable to admit. That thought has made them look at your connection differently. They are no longer asking, "Why can't I forget this person?" They are asking, "Why did I spend so much time pretending I wanted to?" That is a completely different question. It is the question of someone who has stopped running from their own emotions. And the answer is becoming clearer: they never truly wanted to erase you. They wanted to erase the pain of not knowing what would happen if they told you everything. Their private struggle made them feel exposed, uncertain, and emotionally vulnerable, so they chose distance. But distance did not give them peace. It only gave them more time to think about what they had lost. Now, when they remember you, they do not only remember the beautiful moments. They remember the opportunities they ignored. The calls they did not return. The messages they almost sent. The conversations they ended too quickly. And every missed opportunity now feels like another sentence in a story they wish they could rewrite. There is something else your soulmate has been thinking about, and it may explain why their emotions have seemed so unpredictable. They have been comparing the way they felt around you with the way they feel around everyone else. And the comparison has been uncomfortable. With other people, they can maintain a certain emotional distance. They can smile, talk, laugh, and move through ordinary conversations without revealing too much. But with you, something was different. You seemed to reach places inside them that they normally kept protected. That is why the connection became frightening when their circumstances changed. They knew that if they told you what they had discovered, they would have to reveal more than a fact. They would have to reveal their fear, their uncertainty, and their vulnerability. They would have to let you see the person behind the confident exterior. And your soulmate was not prepared for that. So they did what many people do when emotions become overwhelming: they withdrew. They became quieter. They created distance. They convinced themselves that silence was safer than honesty. But there was one thing they could never silence: the memory of how safe they once felt with you. That memory kept returning when they least expected it.